Hello, welcome back. This is Roger Royce, host of the 10,000 Startups podcast, and I'm also a partner with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto doing emerging growth and venture capital. And for this week's episode, we're going to talk about valuation. And the good news is we're talking with valuation with a valuation professional. So we'll learn why it's important, how it gets done, when you need it, different types of valuations, and a few tips on the importance of evaluation to your startup company. We have Petra Loer with us today. She's a managing director and member of the Valuation Services Group at Andersen. Her experience includes the valuation of closely held businesses, business interest, intangibles, intellectual property, debt, and derivatives for a lot of purposes, including financial reporting, tax planning, litigation support, M&A, etc. So Petra, I want to thank you for being here with us today. And I'm looking forward to this topic because valuation is something that, it just comes up all the time in my practice for sure. So let's kind of jump right into it. And when I say valuation in the startup context, people immediately think 409A valuation because they
Yes.
know they have to have them, and that every company has stock options if you got stock option. So, but let me put it to you, for the people, just to level set here. What is a 409A valuation, and why do we want one?
Sure, Roger. It's funny that you made that comment that startup founders love to talk about that topic. I was at a kid's birthday party on Sunday, and I mentioned that I do valuation, and the father said, "Oh, you mean like 409A valuation?" Because he works for a climate change startup. So it comes up a lot. So 409A is Internal Revenue Code Section 409A. It's a shortcut for that. Basically, what that governs is this concept of deferred compensation. So the IRS wants to make sure that when you're a company and you're issuing equity in the form of, let's say, stock options, which are really common for startups, RSUs, profits, interests, et cetera, that you're issuing them at what's called fair market value, either at fair market value or above. So if you issue this equity below fair market value, you get trapped in this 409A deferred compensation rules. And what would happen is the option gets issued to the employee. If the employee ends up exercising that option, and let's say they get audited by the IRS, then the IRS is going to say, oh, well, where's your support for the value that you exercise your stock at? And if the IRS determines that that value is below fair market value, there's nasty consequences for the employee. So basically, the employee gets subject to immediate taxation. There's interest charges. There's also penalties. For the employer, there might be payroll taxes they have to pay. They might have penalties for those as well. So it's something that companies don't want to catch their employees in. Many startups think it's an employer issue, and it certainly is because it affects the employees. But it really comes down to if the IRS audits the individual's tax return.
It must be a tough thing to do, a 409A valuation for an early stage company that doesn't really have a lot going on yet. They might be pre-revenue. They might not have filed any patents. They might not have hired a lot of people, but nevertheless, they want to grant options to people. What do you do in that case? Do you even try, or do you just say, forget it?
Well, valuation is really subjective, right? It's an art and a science at the same time. So I always joke, like when I do training for our new hires, and I always say, well, valuation's not rocket science. Like I could have my 12-year-old son do a valuation in Excel and come up with a number, but it probably wouldn't make any sense is the problem. So that's what valuation experts provide, right? Is that context. So what I have, the process that I go through is basically, I always want to have a conversation to understand the facts, right? Have you had a recent round of financing? Do you have any revenue? Do you have expectations for revenue going forward? If no, what is your exit plan? Are you a pre-revenue biopharma, for example, right? So in those cases, their value is kind of binary, right? It's like you have a big exit event. in the future if everything goes well, like you pass through your clinical trials. And then on the other hand, you could fail. So there's like two scenarios. So depending on what type of business it is, what stage it's at, it really, the approach that we use to do the valuation varies. Now, for a lot of these like early stage startups, if they have a safe note or a convertible note or, you know, a seed round of financing or something, that's an outside indicator of value that like an investor has decided that they're going to put some sort of valuation cap or some expectation of a future round or something. That helps us because then we can start to think about, okay, what is this investor thinking the company is valued at? And we can triangulate to that value. In the absence of that, I mean, sometimes we have to look at costs. Sometimes we have to say, you know, how much have they spent in development efforts? And if I were an investor in this, what kind of return would I want on those investments over time? It's not, you know, that's an imperfect method, but you kind of have to use hopefully more than one method to try to triangulate to what, you know, what makes sense.
Yeah, you know, that first one you said was really interesting, what the investor thinks it's worth. And a typical safe, and when we use convertible notes, there'll be a valuation cap. And I keep telling my clients, look, that's not your proxy for value. That's just like a safety measure
Yeah.
against a runaway valuation. But they all think about it as a proxy for value. And I guess what you're saying is that's something that may even impact the number you come up with if you don't have better, I guess, better metrics out there, right?
Yeah, it can impact it, but it's not the same thing as the value. And I have a lot of clients who, you know, are rightfully confusing the concept of, let's say, a pre-money valuation or a valuation cap and the actual fair market value of the company. Those are different things in most contexts. And so if you have a company that has preferred investment in it, preferred shares are usually worth more than common. So in that case, you're going to have a value that's, you know, markedly different from a pre-money valuation.
Yeah, and the safe's going to convert into preferred typically. So let's pause on that, the common versus the preferred. So when you do the 409A, you're actually valuing the stock and not just the stock, but the common stock, right?
Right.
So that's way different than the value of the business as a whole, I assume.
Yes.
And so tell me about discounts. Do they apply in this case?
They do. So our starting point for value is that we always look at the total company value to start, unless there's been a like a secondary transaction. And, you know, that's a whole other podcast probably about like, you know, if someone buys directly common stock in a company, does that, you know, influence our valuation for the common stock? But normally what we would do is like we'd value the company as a whole. And then we'd look at the articles of incorporation or the operating agreement, and we'd try to understand, okay, what is their capital structure? And then what are the rights and preferences that accrue to like each class, right? So like the Series A, the seed, you know, common, what's the order of priority? And we build basically a waterfall in sorts. We often use option pricing modeling to kind of capture the time value of money in this. That's a whole other discussion, but when we take the total company value, we layer in all of the different rights and preferences, we come down to a value for the common stock. And that value is on a marketable basis. So this is valuation speak. There's a concept of marketable and non-marketable. So marketable would be like, you know, Salesforce stock or IBM stock or something where you could trade it on the open market. Because private companies don't have that, if I'm buying shares in your startup, Roger, I'm not going to pay dollar for dollar for that investment because I'm going to say, well, I don't know your management team. I don't know how long it's going to take for me to get a dollar out of this, you know, company. When are you going to have a liquidity event? Am I going to get any distributions along the way? So all of these things influence the discount. And I would say, you know, a discount for lack of marketability for really early stage companies, it can be 30 to 40%, sometimes higher. If you're dealing with like a blockchain company,
Yeah,
it could
let
be a
me
lot
pause on
higher.
that for a second because boy, you said a lot. So the discount then is to like the overall the I guess the value of the company as a whole. Well, let me back up. Are you saying that what you would do is like a liquidation value? Is that your starting point? You'd say, what happens if we sell the company for what it's worth and we just distribute the proceeds? This is what the common we get. Is that the starting point? And then from there, you'll discount for marketability?
Um, it's not exactly a liquidation value. So
Okay.
there's a concept called current value method, which if you know there's an imminent transaction, you can do it that way and just say,
Yeah.
what are the proceeds to the different classes?
Mhm.
Usually what we'll say is the company is expecting a liquidity event in the future. It could be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the road. And so we use option models to model out, how much would I pay for the option of getting an, value in the future. And
Oh,
so
I see.
it's not a straight like liquidation waterfall in most
Gotcha.
cases. Yeah.
Wow, it sounds complicated. No wonder. Um, and backing up, you used a term, you said something really interesting. You talked about secondary sales. And boy, I'm seeing more and more of that now. And as the SEC has gotten just way tougher on, getting people liquidity in companies in the US, I've seen more secondaries. And by secondary, what we mean is the founder then will just sell his shares directly to an investor, and then the founder cashes out that way, as opposed to the investor buying stock from the company. So now, if there is that secondary sale, that's a third party sale. I think you said that's going to influence your 409A valuation. Is that right?
It might,
It
yeah.
might.
And so it depends on a few factors, like, what is the volume of the shares being transacted? Is it a really kind of one-off scenario? Is there a pattern? Does the company have a pattern of these transactions? Who are the buyers and sellers? Like, do they know anything about the company? Because a lot of the time, these buyers and sellers, or the sellers might know something, the buyers don't know anything. They have no information rights. So there's kind of lots of factors that go into whether we weight them or not. At an extreme, the secondary might be the value.
Hmm.
But more often than not, the secondary it's weighted, it might be weighted 10% or given some, 20% indication, like, okay, maybe an investor believes the company is worth this, but we're also going to use our other methods to value
Yeah,
the
and
company.
in the secondaries I do, there's another step to this. So investor buys common from founder, but then that common converts into
Oh,
preferred. So it's kind of like apples and oranges, isn't it?
it is. I mean, in those situations, the investor really wants preferred, and
Right,
this is the only way that they can make it happen. So
right.
those are maybe not as influential on our value.
Yeah, okay. Um, so so marketability, are there any other discounts? Because I'm not Salesforce, so you gotta like ding the stock because it's not as quick, to go out and sell in the market. Are there any other discounts that are going to apply when you do this?
So marketability is the one that it always applies. Occasionally we'll have a voting rights discount.
Yes.
So either the stock that's being issued to employees is non-voting stock, or there's high voting stock in the company and low voting stock, right? Like there might be like 10x voting. And
Hmm.
so if you're looking at that differential, then there is another discount. But that's a very minor one. That's something like 3 to 5%. Whereas,
Yeah.
the marketability might be 30, 40, or sometimes even more.
Wow. Okay. Well, and of course the objective here, that's good though, because the objective here is to get that valuation, that 409 valuation as low as possible, because we want to grant options at that price. So the option is a strike price at the 409A value. So the lower the value, the more valuable the option, the less equity we have to give up, the happier the employees are. So I totally get that. Let me, and I guess one last point on this. So we need this for tax, right?
Right.
Because if we don't have the valuation, then we don't know that we've granted the option at fair market value. And it's
Mhm.
for tax for options. That's the biggest reason. And if that gets messed up, then of course the employee has deferred comp because in effect, the option is a form of deferred comp. And this is the carve out. So that's why it's essential,
That's
right,
right.
for
Yeah,
companies
I
to
mean, I
do.
consider it an insurance policy for the company, right, to have a valuation.
In your experience, will the IRS accept these pretty, or do they challenge them from time to time?
So I'll be perfectly honest, there have not been that many cases where the IRS has challenged these at all, over the, this came out in 2004, so over the last, 20 years. Um, Partly because it's kind of out of the wheelhouse of the IRS agents who are reviewing it, right? So if you have a 409A appraisal, that's that's a safe harbor. You've met the safe harbor rule. You've hired a third party appraiser. And if you do that, the bar is really high, like for the IRS. Like they have to basically disprove the valuation expert. If
Yeah.
you don't have an appraisal and you just make it up yourself, that's where the IRS can come in and challenge you, right? They're going to say, like, what's your basis? Give me all your, in materials, like all your information.
Yeah. With 2020 hindsight.
Of
And
course.
in
Yeah.
my world, I've seen companies go from 0 to $100 million in 6 months. That
Of
happens in startup land.
mhm.
And if you're the IRS agent looking back on it, you're going to say, "Oh, come on, the option couldn't have been worth, a penny in January when it was $1 in June." But if you got, what you're saying is you have a safe harbor, though. If you got that professional valuation, you could just wave that at them, and they typically will go away, I think is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's why it's super important. Um, yeah, what's interesting about that? The rule is way different in other areas of valuation. Like I've been involved with S corporations, C corps S corps that convert to C, and we need valuations in that context because we have to know the value of the company. And those ones, especially here in California, we get challenged every time. Every time they pull out, IRS will pull out their experts. We'd have to find someone like you and duke it out because we didn't have that safe harbor like we have in the tax code that just protects you. The fact that you get the valuation is the protection, really. um, so let's shift gears a little bit on that because we could talk about 409A all day, of course, but there's other places where we need valuations. And I think I just used one example. My S corporation clients that want to convert to C corp, they have this
Mhm.
built-in gain that has to be preserved for. The rule is different for state and federal, but let's say 5 years federal, they have to preserve this built-in gain. So if they sell the company, uh, within 5 years of converting to C corp, they got to pay corporate level tax on the gain if they sell the assets earlier. So we get a valuation to lock that number in. So that's another place we would use it, but that's a completely different kind of valuation, isn't it? Because now we're valuing assets.
That's right. Yeah. The total assets of the business.
Okay. And similarly, we have this happen all the time, qualified small business stock. And this is where I'm seeing valuation professionals pop up more and more as well, because in order for stock, we all know, just to level set, we all know qualify small business stock. If you buy the stock, you hold it from the company at original issue, you hold it for 5 years, and then sell it. You can exclude up to $10 million or 10 times cost basis from
Mhm.
federal income tax, not state. There's a lot of requirements in that, one of which is the company cannot have been worth more than, I say worth, but you're going to explain what I mean by that in a minute,
Yeah.
worth more than $50 million at the time that the stock was issued. So we got to go get a valuation. So tell me about the QSBS valuation and how does that work?
It's so funny because these QSBS rules and benefits have been around for a long time. And in the last year, I've just seen an acceleration of companies and counsel and advisors telling their clients they need to think about QSBS. It's hugely powerful, right? Like you were mentioning, you can exclude $10 million or 10x the basis, so the greater of the two. Um, Basically, we have a lot of clients getting qualified small business stock valuations at the time they are converting from an LLC to a C corporation. That's the most common. So you'll have like a startup, a founder who, has a dream, starts putting together a business plan, et cetera, in an LLC. And then they want to go raise an outside round of financing, and the investors say, well, no, I need you to be a C corporation in order to do that investment. So on the day where the LLC converts into a C corporation, and often at that time, the investor puts money in, you can get a valuation at that time for two reasons, right? One is to figure out, make sure your company is worth 50 million or less. But the other reason is to set your basis, right? And your potential benefit, QSBS benefit. So if you, let's say you hired me to do evaluation, your startup, you're just getting an outside round of financing. I value your company at 30 million at this conversion date. So and I'm not a tax professional. So, and I should have said from the beginning, actually, the opinions expressed in this podcast are my own and not Andersen's. So I apologize. I didn't say that up front. And I'm not a tax professional. I'm a valuation professional. But for anything below 30 million, you're going to pay tax. So you're going to pay tax on the difference between fair market value, the 30 million, and your basis in the stock, right? But for anything above 30 million, if you have an exit event at 300 million, that would be a $270 million gain usually, but you can exclude up to 300, right? So it's hugely powerful to get a contemporaneous valuation. So at the time that you do the conversion, when I have all the facts and I can document that I knew what I knew on the date of value, then I can do a valuation, set the basis, and then you can have that benefit. I also have clients who get to the end and they have a liquidity event and then say, oh, shoot, I qualified for this QSBS benefit. Can I get a valuation now going back? And that's called a retrospective valuation. And yeah, I can do that. And obviously the benefit, it's hugely beneficial to the client because if they get my valuation, they can use that to exclude the tax. But it's just not as supportable in the eyes of the IRS. Because like you said, the IRS likes to use hindsight. So they're going to say, really, was your company worth that, 10 years ago? So it's much better to do it at the time that you do the conversion.
Right, right. And this might sound a little legalistic, but the burden of proof is on the taxpayer, right? It's not that the IRS has to prove that your number is wrong. You have to prove your number's right. So how do you do that? You get a professional to weigh in on it. And that scenario you just described to me, where you just kind of wait, and then you go back. The problem is, like you said, now we've got all these facts that played out, and they've played out well, obviously. Otherwise, you wouldn't be getting the valuation. So it might impact where that number is. Okay, well, thanks for that. Yeah, that's where I see it come up to LLC conversions, and or the other time is when someone wants to exercise an option or something. They want to buy stock and they want to know what the value is at the time. I see that less often, but theoretically, I suppose.
Well, and I'll just put a plug in too. Like I say that it's, cost efficient for clients to get the QSBS and the 498 at the same time, right? So for me to do both valuations, it's a lot more cost effective than if you hire two different firms to do the QSBS valuation, the 498 valuation, and anything else.
I want to talk about that because I've been in cases with, well, first of all, just to be clear, two different valuations, but they are based on the same company, right? So you've already got all of the, the metrics. But I've been in situations where we have had dueling valuations, and not so much a QSBS 409A because the company's controlling all that. It's gift tax valuations. So we've done all of this, very clever, sophisticated, careful tax planning at the corporate level. And all of a sudden the shareholder pops up with a gift tax valuation for their shares because they made a gift that says something completely different. So tell me, what is a gift tax valuation, and do people even still do those?
A lot, actually. And for serial entrepreneurs, on their third startup or whatever, I see them on that date of conversion. They'll do a QSBS, a 409A, and a gift tax valuation all kind of together. And yes, it's a complicated issue. I'll just say also the QSBS is actually for the individual. So the company might hire the appraiser, but ultimately the individual is the one who's going to use it. So
good point.
Yeah. So the 409A is really the only one that is the corporate one, where the company is the one hiring the appraiser fully. So, but a gift tax valuation or a charitable donation valuation, those are even more fraught Basically an individual who wants to give assets to their kids' trusts, for example, or donate assets to charity. And a lot of these startup founders don't have a lot of assets besides their company stock. They'll choose to do these valuations, right, to use up part of their lifetime exemption, which is pretty high at the moment. So clients can do that. The values shouldn't be different is the problem. And I had this conversation with my tax partner recently because his client, wanted to argue that the values were different. And I said, they shouldn't be different, right? If I were the IRS and I were an IRS agent, I would absolutely ask for any appraisals that the client had, right? So I would look at their QSBS valuation, I look at their 409A valuation and their gift tax. And if those numbers are different, that's a problem. The gift tax appraisal report actually concludes the value of what was gifted. So like if you gifted 2 million common shares, that's the conclusion that would be in there. Whereas a 409A appraisal concludes the value of 1 common share. So they're, the transmittal letter looks different. The value conclusion looks different. But when you talk about the underlying stock value, it should technically be the same if it's as of the same date.
Okay, that was my next question. Should they be the same? And the answer is they should be.
Yeah.
And okay, all the more reason to maybe have one party kind of doing it all. Let me ask you about other types of valuations. You also value IP, I notice. When would somebody want to do that?
Hey, a case that's come up a lot actually is I have a lot of clients who are nonprofits and are spinning off a business line to become a for-profit.
Yeah.
And so they'll sell the assets or contribute the assets into a new for-profit entity and will need an IP valuation. It comes up mostly in the context of the corporate restructurings, right? Where you have intellectual property, you're setting up a new entity, maybe as a holding company for that IP, or you're just transferring it to another entity for whatever reason, usually for, housekeeping purposes. And you need the value to make sure that you're paying fair market value.
Yeah. And also maybe in international context for transfer
sure.
pricing, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other places where you are, any other scenarios where you're asked to value IP or companies or assets that you want to talk about?
Well, what we've talked about is tax for tax
Yeah.
purposes, all the various reasons.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning, I do financial reporting as well. So
Yeah.
what that means is, companies who have GAAP financials, they need to value assets at fair value and their transactions at fair value. That's probably a whole separate conversation, but if a company makes an acquisition of another business and they, have GAAP financials, they need to value all of the assets that were acquired. So technology, trade names, customer relationships, and all of that.
Oh, I see, for financial reporting.
For financial reporting.
And then the excess is goodwill, right?
That's right. Yeah. And then that's what they put on their balance sheet.
And then you also do valuations to measure impairment of goodwill, I suppose. Is that you?
Yeah, that's right. So if companies, after the acquisition, year 1, year 2, year 3, every year they have to test that goodwill balance to make sure it's still worth what it was, what it was acquired for or higher. And if it's not, they take an impairment, they write down that asset, and they have to hire someone like me to do that.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and that's why we're doing this podcast, because valuation is important in a lot of scenarios that might be a little counterintuitive, or that people might not expect. Well, I want to thank you for being here, Petra. My one last question is, if people want to contact you, how do they get a hold of you?
I love that question. So I'm in the San Francisco office of Andersen. My email address is petra.loer@andersen.com. Yeah, and I look forward to fielding any questions people have.
Okay, I'll put all of your contact information in the show notes to the video and the podcast. And again, thanks for being here. This is Roger Royce with the 10,000 Startups podcast, and I've been talking to Petra Loer on valuation and we'll see you all next time.